And welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity Podcast, hosted by John and Alex Soutsos. This is part 2 of a really incredible conversation with Craig Custance. And if you didn't listen to part 1 yet, you can go back. You can stick around for part 2 before you go listen to part 1. So, Alex, no further ado, let me hand this back to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Yes, we are pleased to be joined again by Craig Custance for part 2 of our discussion, discussing his book, The Building of Winning Teams. And so I'm going to turn it over to my dad really quickly, because, Dad, I know in the last part you had another question that you wanted to touch upon with Craig.
So this is a huge question. Was the NHL going to a salary cap a good idea? Is the game better off today because of it, or is it worse off? And if you have any iterations in between those two extremes, feel free.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I come from two perspectives. I grew up in Detroit, a Red Wings fan, in an era where they could spend all of Mike Ilitch's money and get whatever they needed to win a Stanley Cup. And as a Red Wings fan in the early 90s, that was pretty great. But I also was in Atlanta, where I covered the Atlanta Thrashers, and saw, a non-traditional market that didn't have those kind of resources. And so, if you truly want to be a league that has not to sound like Gary Bettman, but it has a footprint, around the U.S. In non-traditional markets, I do think there needed to be some sort of solution there.
That begs the question, though. Does the NHL need to be? I understand Bettman's perspective about being in every market from an advertising perspective, but could the NHL, without the certain franchises in the South, still be a source of entertainment and grow its product without having as many teams in the U.S. market and having the salary cap?
Yeah, I would say no, John, to be honest. Like, I think if you cut it down and you just had your kind of original six and some Canadian teams and Chicago, Pittsburgh's and some of these other teams, it would become even more of a niche sport than it is now. I think, especially in the U.S., I see it all the time, just how hard it is to compete for the entertainment dollar, the entertainment space and media. We see it at The Athletic. It's really hard for hockey to compete in that space. And I think if it was really further regionalized and it wasn't in Miami, where, the Florida Panthers have this incredible run, or I spent so much time in California that during the Kings heyday that I had to pay taxes in California. But like, I saw the impact in that market in LA when those teams were that good. And so I'm actually a believer that if you care about growth in the league, you care about, again, I don't know if fans in Toronto care about any of this, but if you truly care about franchise values, you look at what Tampa Bay just got for their like Vinnick sold a cut of his franchise and he's making billions. Again, the fans don't care about that, but the league does. Then I do believe you have to be everywhere. I think you can't be a regional league if you want to compete with the biggest in the world. So
I'm old enough to remember the very first expansion. That's why I'm still a fan, right? Because I'm old enough. And the perception in the first few expansions was that there just isn't enough talent to populate a team going from 6 to 12 and then from 12 to 14, et cetera. We're now at I've lost count, 33 teams?
32
teams. Okay. Do you, or I don't know how much of a student of hockey history you are. You seem like you probably are. But do you think the skill set is sufficiently large to put together a great product night in, night out?
Yeah, I do. John, you've lived it and you've watched the game, but through the years in a way that I can't. But like, I watch now and I see the level of skill, on a night in, night out basis, and I see players doing stuff I've never seen. You know what I mean? Like when Connor McDavid came into the league, you were just he blew people out of the water, and I think you can attribute that to a couple things. It became a global sport, so I think the answer would be no if we were dependent on Canada to to produce 100% of the players. But now you see, so many great players from Sweden and Russia and also the growth of the game in the United States. I mean, it's still a very small percentage of.
I was just going to say, I think we're just scratching the surface on the United States being a contributor to the NHL talent.
100%. And it continues to grow every year. And it's you see the national development team that the USA Hockey has put together over the last 20 years, whatever. And now you're just seeing the fruit of all of that with some of these great American players. So I don't think talent is an issue. I think the game itself, the gameplay is in a pretty good place. I mean, I think the length of schedule, like it's not a perfect product. Like I think the schedule's too long. I don't think they need to be playing as early in the season as they do. Like it's a money grab for the bigger teams. And I think that if you talk about, if you're tuning into a game in October, you're like, okay, it's a completely different product than April. So I think that's a problem. But in terms of just the talent on the ice, I think it's as good as it's ever been right now.
I'd love to see a schedule cut back. We talk about football, and they're playing once a week, and they're pounding each other. And here you have hockey, and they're pounding each other sometimes 4 days a week. I think that's insane. I think you got to go back to a schedule that's 2 games a week.
I don't think that we'll ever get to that point. I think at most we'd ever see them do is go back to a 70-odd game schedule, but even that I don't think is all that likely.
The owners aren't giving money back. Like that's they're not gonna, as long as people are buying tickets. Yeah.
If anything, they'll do more games. I think what they're already talking about is cutting out 2 preseason games and tacking it on, making it an 84 game regular season. Again, like it used to be for a short time in the early 90s. But Craig, you mentioned Atlanta a couple times, and it's piqued my interest because whenever they talk about expansion. And I'm not opposed to expansion. I think there are some good markets out there. Houston jumps to mind as a market to me, which is really intriguing. But the idea of going back to Atlanta for a third time makes my eyeballs boil in my socket. And I can't believe anybody would want to go back and let's do part 3 of the Thrasher/Flames. You worked in Atlanta. Do you think you're going to have better insight than obviously we would have up here? Do you think that market can work for the NHL?
I think it can. I've got a couple caveats though that I would put. Like Atlanta, I lived there for 10 years. It's a very transient city. It's, I was there for 2 years before I met anybody who was actually from Atlanta. It was like Buffalo and New York, it was Detroit, it was Chicago,
Yeah.
It was, and then finally they were like Atlanta. And I'm like, no, where are you originally from? And they're like, no, Atlanta. And I was like, whoa. So it's, there was a lot. So I think that damages, it's hard. So people were coming there, it's this massive city, but people are fans of other teams and other sports. And, you would go to a Sabres Thrashers game on a Sunday afternoon and it was 60% Sabres fans. You know what I mean? And I think that happens in a lot of markets when the team isn't good. But I think would people point to the Thrashers era as a reason not to go to Atlanta? I think it's they don't realize how
bad the ownership was.
How bad the ownership was. It was for the most part it was ownership that was interested in having an NBA franchise, the Hawks. They were NBA folks who weren't interested in the hockey team. They went 10 years without winning a single playoff game. And, the one time they made the playoffs, I was there. They got their doors blown off by the New York Rangers. It wasn't even a series. They lost in 4 games. They switched goalies a game into it. So so that city, that was looking for a reason to cheer that team on, never got it. So when you look back and say that it failed the second time, it's true, but also there was no reason for the fans to support that product anymore. And I would also say I've seen this in cities that people think are great hockey cities. I'm seeing it in Detroit, where now if you go to a Leafs game versus the Red Wings, it's half Leafs fans because the Red Wings fans are just tired of not being in the playoffs. And this is hockey town, and this is happening. I saw it in Chicago before the Blackhawks, were good again. There was 1,000 people in that arena, and Rocky Wirtz used to tell this story where when he took over as owner, where he went to a game and he thought he had got the time wrong. There was so few people it was John McDonough. Sorry, John McDonough. When he became the president, he's like, yeah. I thought I showed up and he's like, oh, it must be at 7, not 3 or whatever. And that's because nobody was in the building. And this is the Chicago Blackhawks. This is original 6. Same thing. Pittsburgh almost moved to Kansas City.
Bill Wirtz shot them in the foot.
Yeah, they were mismanaged by ownership. This is the kind of the thread throughout. If you have bad ownership, it's not going to succeed.
Right.
So when people ask me, can Atlanta succeed as a NHL city? I say yes, but it has to have an owner who's committed to hockey, who's going to give them the resources, who's going to be, again, like a Jeff Vinnick type, where we have the money to spend. I know there's hockey fans in Atlanta. I saw them. I interacted with them. They filled the building. It's a massive market in the U.S. in terms of television. It's not a great sports town, though. It's just not. Like it's because. So I think it has its own challenges. You just have to get ownership right, and you have to succeed, and I think it would work. But
and that's where my concern was. You're looking at Atlanta as a sports town. You go back to the Atlanta Braves of the 2000s, basically the 90s through the early 2010s. Like, that team made the playoffs every single year, and people stopped showing up because they got tired of it, because they would never make it through to the World Series. And as a Blue Jays fan, where they missed making the playoffs, forget even winning any rounds, they didn't make the playoffs for 22 years. I was just itching for any sort of playoff baseball, and the idea that somebody would say, "Nah, you know what? I don't want to go because we can't get out of the the division series of the NLCS," was just ludicrous to me. But I get your point. I do remember that ownership group was running on a shoestring budget. I remember Phillips Arena at the time had that one side of the stadium that was all suites, which looked ridiculous, and so it wasn't a great fan experience as well. So if you did go to the games, you weren't really getting the best product. And then you pick Patrick Stefan first overall, and yikes,
set the tone from there. Yeah. So
yeah,
just a lot of mistakes along the way in terms of building the roster, and then you start taking shortcuts. So I was there. They had to make the playoffs, and so they trade a first for Keith Tkachuk, and just give this massive overpay to bring in Keith Tkachuk. They end up trading Braden Coburn, who was kind of ended up becoming the defenseman they needed for 10 years, for Alexei Zhitnik. Like, all these really short-term decisions in terms of building a team, all so they could make the playoffs, because they're in the city where they just felt pressure to do it. And like, that's not how you run an organization successfully.
It's not, which is actually, I think, unfortunate, because that tarnished Don Waddell's reputation as a GM, because coming from Detroit, he had an excellent reputation, and then, his years in Atlanta really set him back. And it wasn't until Tom Dundon was looking for somebody, and he just ended up being in-house as an advisor, that he just said, you know what, that's fine, I'll just make him the GM.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, we'll put a pin in that for now, and you and I could maybe discuss Atlanta offline, because I got some more thoughts.
yeah, that's right. Let's turn this into Atlanta hockey talk for an hour.
Yeah, exactly. We'll do a whole podcast just on Atlanta hockey. And speaking with all these different general managers in the book, who surprised you the most? Was there one person who where you had an impression of them from the outside, and then after speaking with them, it was completely opposed to what you thought you were going to get from them when you went into the conversation?
I don't think so. Part of the reason I was able to get the access I got with a lot of these people, the owners and GMs and presidents, was I'd been covering the league a long time. I'd gotten to know them. For the most part, these are people that I've been dealing with for a long time. So I wouldn't say there were any surprises. I think the one that maybe went differently than I thought was George McPhee, who, is kind of a quieter, a little bit guarded at times. And I happened, and I've been covering George for a long time. And so, there's a relationship there, but I went to the ring ceremony in Vegas and spent some time with the player, saw the players get their rings. And it was just kind of this really cool scene to be at that dinner, like this private dinner. And then the next day spent some time with George. And I think just catching him in this moment in time where, he's wearing the ring around the office for the first time. Like, this is a guy that had gone through so much in Washington, a lot of failure and a lot of learning from failure. And he brought all of that to Vegas, and he was so open about what he learned in Washington. And he was just in a how it is, guys, when you have this accomplishment, you get really reflective. And I caught him in this moment in time where he was reflective about his time in Washington. He was reflective about what they were able to build in Vegas from nothing. And I think that conversation, probably of all of them, was maybe not what I expected, just because of the moment in time in which we had it.
I loved his comment. When you asked him about that first year, they go to the Stanley Cup final as an expansion team, which was a remarkable achievement. And to have the fortitude to say, take an honest look at the team and say, are we really that close, or
Right.
was this a flash in the pan? And they said, no, I think this is a flash in the pan. We need to get better. A lot of teams would have clung to that success, and I love David Poyle. I thought he was an excellent general manager for his years in Washington and in Nashville. But I think that team that went to the Stanley Cup Finals in 2017 probably overachieved a little bit. And David Poyle, thinking they were closer than they were, started making some decisions that in hindsight were not in the best interest of the organization. I think they should have taken more of a patient approach. But it obviously catapulted that organization into another stratosphere of popularity and making it a destination. But they weren't as close as they probably thought they were at the time. And I think for George and his group to sit there and say, you know what, we're not there yet, that was a very intelligent and courageous decision on his part.
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier about patience and keeping things together, if you believe that's the right thing to do. And this was the opposite. This was again, it's tough decisions. This is somebody with him and Kelly McCrimmon realizing, hey, this was a bit of a fluke more than anything. And again, you're putting your job on the line. Oftentimes when you're managing a team, like when we talk about the Toronto, I think the easier thing for Kyle Dubas to do would have been to trade somebody like Mitch Marner, because then you're placing the blame on him. And he talked about that. Or Julian Brisebois said the easy thing after we get bounced by Columbus after winning a President's Trophy in the first round, the easier thing to do is to fire the coach, because now it's on him. When you bring people back, now the pressure's on you. Or in the case of George McPhee, when you tear down a team that went to the Stanley Cup final, now all the attention's on him. And he did it anyways. And they didn't believe they had the ingredients you needed to win a Stanley Cup, which is a number one center, number one defenseman. They just were like, this was a bit of a fluke. And Alex, like, I was talking to players, I was talking to agents at that time, and Vegas was getting crushed behind the scenes. And I don't know how much of it became public, but people were like, oh, Kelly and George think they're smarter than everybody else. They're tearing down this team. This team was incredible chemistry. These are popular players with the fans. What a huge mistake, because these guys think they're the smartest guys in the room, just getting hammered. And they just sat there and they took their arrows and they just said, hey, this is what we're convicted about. This is what we believe success looks like. This is what we have to do. They changed coaches 3 times. Like, you think about Gerard Gallant has that great run. You bring in Pete DeBoer, widely respected. Like, Pete, has done a great job in Dallas, but like, same thing. And, and then they bring in Bruce Cassidy, and that's all, I think, a reflection of what George learned in Washington. He talked about that in the book. He's just like, I don't mess around with coaches anymore. If I see it's not working, we're done. If I see a chance to upgrade, we're making that upgrade. And again, that takes guts. It also, it invites criticism. So I think it's full credit for them to pull it off.
Now, I got 2 more questions here, and then I'll throw it back to my dad to take over. But first of all, I'll flip the order of the questions I was going to go in. Why do you think so many teams and managers struggle to be as ruthless and remove emotion from their decisions, like the Golden Knights and the Lightning? Obviously they've demonstrated that you need that kind of approach in order to be successful over an extended period of time. Why don't more teams practice that? Why do so many teams and so many managers get caught up in the myopic and making, like you said, make the deal to save your job, if you will?
I think because it's hard. Like, that's a stupid answer, but it's really hard. It's hard to fire people. I don't know if either of you have ever had to do that. I'm sure, John, like, it's like you're sitting there and you don't sleep for 2 weeks and you're like, is there another way to deal with this? And these are people that Jim Nill talked about it. And, he's had to fire, like, Jim's like the nicest, sweetest guy you'll ever meet. And he's like, but you have to make this change. And he's like, I don't sleep for weeks. Is there another path out of this? And it's like, no, we just have to do it. And not only that, you're close with, you're on the road with these people. So so like, oftentimes they become your family. Like, their families are at home or they're in another city. And so you're sitting there with the players and you're sitting there with these coaches, and these are the people that you're spending 95% of your time with. And then you have to walk in and tell somebody, that's it. And your wives are no longer friends. And, you know, like you've cut off a relationship maybe for the rest of your life in some cases. And that, like, these were the kind of conversations I had for this book. And like one thing that led me to realize, you talk about some of the common threads, like these are like lonely jobs. Like these are like when you're going through this and you fired this guy that you're friends with, and the fans all think you're an idiot. So you're just getting hammered publicly. And, you know, like, you're sitting there believing in your convictions. So I think it's way easier to just please the fans. And you know, a couple people mentioned this. I forgot who said it first, but they would say there's a difference between keeping your job and doing your job. And the best ones do their job and they take the criticism. And the ones who aren't as great will do things just to keep their job and just try to manage and keep criticism low. And you know, the best ones don't believe that works.
Yeah, and I think it is tough. And I know just in experience, a lot of teams seem to be very afraid from walking away from players, you know, based on age or salary demands, especially because I'm sure there's pressure from the ownership to say, you know, this is a popular player in our fan base and our community. Like a guy like Steven Stamkos comes to mind. You know, it would have been easy for Julien Brisebois to just say, you know what, Lifetime Achievement Award, Steven, here's your contract for, you know, $8 million and you can stick around and we'll figure it out. Instead, he said, you know what? I think we can get somebody like Jake Gensel, who's 6 years younger than you, who can come in and provide the same, if not better, production over the tenure of this contract for the same price. And he was, you know, time will tell if he was right. So far this year, he's been right. But that takes a lot of courage and fortitude to do. I think it's also difficult because a lot of teams have trouble meeting the asking price of executing transactions. You know, when it comes to trading for a top end talent, the asking price is going to be steep, and there's a lot of sticker shock. And like you said, there's blowback from the fan base. You know, why did you trade this young player, all these draft picks? And a lot of times, in my opinion, those are lottery tickets. You know, some of them have better odds of panning out than others. But, you know, one that came to my mind when I was prepping for this podcast was Ryan McDonough. When he went to Tampa, the Leafs actually had an opportunity to get him, and they were afraid of trading Travis Dermott and Timothy Liljegren, neither of whom panned out, neither of whom were still with the organization because, you know, they felt that the asking price was too high for somebody like McDonough, who was 28 at the time. And I think, you know, going back to Julien Brisebois, you know, he was my favorite one that you covered in the book. Like, I think he's absolutely incredible. I love his creativity. He's shown a willingness to make those kind of trades, to think outside the box and be a little bit creative in his approach. And I think more teams need to have that kind of that thought process when it comes to putting together teams.
And sometimes it doesn't work. Like, you know, I caught Julien. I talked to him a couple times for this book, but one of our longer conversations was around the trade deadline when they traded for Tanner Jeannot, and you know, he gave up a massive haul. It didn't work. Like, and it was one of those things that you know, you go in and you sit there and you weigh all the things and you realize maybe this ends up making us look like a genius, but there's also a possibility that it's just going to make us look terrible. And so you have to deal with that too. And you have to be willing next time you're at the trade deadline. All right, is this a Tanner Jeannot or is this, you know, a Ryan McDonough trade?
Brandon Hagel.
Right. Yeah. And so like even that, like I got into it like in that chapter a little bit, but like just that sliding scale where they started doing it, they started overpaying for these young guys because they believe, Julien and his staff believe they were buying cap space. So they're like, okay, if this guy's a $1 million cap hit, but we think he's a $1.5 million player, we're buying 500,000 of cap space. And that is worth the extra second or third round pick to us. And maybe other organizations don't feel that way, but cap space is such a premium for us because of our great players, the Stamkoses and whatever. So, but did they go too far? Probably at some point with that theory, probably. And I'm sure he's learned from it and will adjust.
One last one for me before I let my dad get a couple more questions in here, Craig. But I just wanted to ask you, there were a lot of great stories and anecdotes in the book. Which one was your favorite?
I loved the Megan Duggan chapter. Like at the end of that was one of those that I could have reported until the end of time. We were talking earlier about having a deadline, and thank God I had one, or else I'd probably still be calling people about Megan, because everybody you talked to just had an incredible story about her and how she operated. And
what a leader.
Yeah, just an incredible leader, and then just the way she guided the Americans, from like just heartbreak and being, crushed by that loss to Canada in Sochi, and to come back. I just love the story of them, winning, and even just like some of the anecdotes about how the locker room was going into the 2 overtimes. And she said, like, going into the first one, it was like we were just faking confidence. We're like, we got this, but like the players kind of knew they knew Canada was the better. They just knew they were going to lose. Like, players know it. And then that second time, based on all the things that they had done over the course of 4 years, they were so confident they were going to win. And then I just, this scene where they get to go and celebrate with their families after having that heartbreak 4 years earlier. I loved all that. So that one for me was so much fun.
Craig, we're Leaf fans. We watched 2013 down up 4-1 with 9 minutes to go in the third period, and try to convince ourselves that we had a chance going into overtime against Boston that we were going to win. And
that's the same thing.
When I read that chapter about Megan, I was like, "Yep, I've been there."
Yeah, that overtime where you're sitting there faking confidence. It's exactly that.
Everything's fine. It's all good. It's like that meme with the dog with the fire around him. Everything's okay.
Everything's okay.
Well, yeah, what's interesting, you guys talking about all these recent developments, and I remember 1972, Team Canada and Paul Henderson recalling in the dressing room late in the series that when they were down after 2 periods in the final game, they knew they were going to come back and win. Like, just complete belief in themselves and confidence. So when you don't have, and I think that's often what distinguishes the winners from the losers, is not skill. It's that where is your head mentally? Right? Do you believe you can get through this? And if you have that strong belief in yourself and in the people on your team, I think you can overcome any gap in talent. And that's what that reminds me about, that whole story. On the subject of Megan Duggan and Tom Dundon, and their names are very similar. I almost thought for a second they were part of the same family, but reading those 2 chapters, I thought it was almost two people cut from the same cloth, like maniacal pursuit of answers in different ways, but maniacal pursuit. And I got tired reading those 2 chapters. Yeah, it's like, how can anyone function like that throughout a day? And I would need a nap 15 times a day to function like that. It's insane. What was your from meeting all these incredible people? They all are truly incredible. I know Alexander just asked you about your favorite. But what do you take away about leadership? The whole concept of leadership. What do you take away after having written this book? Did it change you?
I mean, certainly it changed me in that I was able to steal a bunch of leadership styles or strategies that I've implemented. Like I interview people differently for jobs than I did previously because of what I learned from Julien Brisebois, like how he interviews coaches. And so from that regard, it changed me. I think if I was just to say one thing I took away, and I think this is kind of like comforting on some level, because I'll never be Tom Dundon. I'll never be Megan Duggan. I can't wake up before 7. I'm sorry. Like, some people are like part of the 5 a.m. club and that's how they're wired. I'm just not. I think what I took away was there's a lot of different ways to operate that you can still have success. I think if you have a high standard, I think if you're willing to do hard things, whatever those are, there's a lot of different personality types. Brad Treliving is completely different than Lou Lamoriello, who's completely different than Tom Dundon or Jim Nill or Jim Rutherford or all these people in this book, or George McPhee. Like, these are some varied personality types, and some are, they're just, and so I think that there's a lot of different ways you can build a winner, and there's a lot of different ways you can be from like a leadership point of view as a leader and how you treat people. And I think that's good. Like, there's a lot of different paths of success, but there's seem to be 3 or 4 common themes you have to have. They're kind of non-negotiable,
including being incredibly well organized and detailed in your approach. So, Craig, you're starting from scratch today. How would you go about building a hockey organization. You're adding to the league. You're the 33rd team.
We're bringing Atlanta back.
Sure.
Who would you hire to run your new Atlanta franchise? Imagine the league where you're expanding, and where would you start?
I walked away saying at some point Megan Duggan's going to be a GM of an NHL team. And when I talked to her, she had interviewed for the Penguins job. That went to Kyle Dubas and didn't get it, obviously. But like, I'm like, oh, like you talk about like next generation leader and somebody that can relate to the players, but also is a incredible leader from a management perspective. She would be on my short list. I'd probably bring her in. Maybe try to pry Julien Brisebois away from Tampa. I don't think that would happen. But if you're looking for somebody to promote and give an opportunity to that you can trust the keys of your organization to, that's where I would start.
And who would your coach be?
John Cooper. I think John Cooper's the best coach in the NHL. I think he's
really.
I think the way he relates to players.
So low key.
He's low key, but he holds his players accountable in a way that he earns their respect. People like playing for him.
Charles Barkley likes him.
I think John Cooper is the best coach in the NHL.
So that speaks volumes about him as a person and as a leader. So in this book, it intrigued me because for many years I've always wanted, and I'm not a journalist and I never will be a journalist, and I'm never ever going to write a book on this subject, but now I have you in front of me, so I'm going to ask you, would you follow this format and interview a whole bunch of hockey parents and find out how do you build an NHL player?
I love that question, John. So a lot of people are like, what's your next book going to be? Because the first one was I went around and talked to coaches and spent time with them behind the scenes. And then this was behind the scenes with management. So I think that's a fascinating, how do you build a hockey NHL player and spend time with parents? I love talking to the parents too of these, they're so honest and fun, and they're without the media training too. So that's good too. So you get some really good insight. So I would, it's a great idea, John. I might tuck that one away.
Good. Just put a little acknowledgement in the forward when you write it.
Deal.
To my long-suffering Leaf fan from 1967.
I think they're going to get you one, John. That's my prediction.
I hope so, because I'm getting close to the other end of the boundary in life, and I'd like it to happen before I get to that boundary.
Well, Bill, we'll turn it back over to you. Before we do, just a quick thank you, Craig. The book is called Building Winning Teams by Craig Custance. Please go out and buy it this year. It is a phenomenal book. You will not be disappointed when you do. So thank you very much, Craig. We really enjoyed having you on. It was a great conversation, and we'll let Bill wrap things up here.
Honestly, it was an easy read and very enjoyable.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, guys. It was a fun conversation.
That was great. And the book sounds fantastic. And I think I'm going to have to pick it up, as a matter of fact. Just before I wrap it up, one quick thought. I was a kid who grew up in Texas. And I grew up in summers that were 110 degrees. Okay. And in 1996, I interviewed Gary Bettman. And I said to him, buddy, if some guy come up to me and said, kid, there's a sport that you can play where you can go inside and skate on ice in the summertime, I and every one of the friends I knew would have been there on the ice and skating and getting out of the heat. And he laughed. But, there's the secret to growing a league is when you expand into areas like that, then you find kids like once upon a time, little Billy, who would have been like, sure, I'll give it a shot. I'll get in on the ice.
Or Austin Matthews.
There you go. It's like and that's how it happens. And yeah, it's still a niche, but it's a much, much bigger niche than it was. I mean, and all jokes aside, John, you and Alex and I have joked about this. I mean, you've got Americans carrying around the Stanley Cup. And I know that's painful to you all, and I understand why it is.
You know what? It's not painful at all to me. I appreciate skill and talent, and I knew where I was going with that question for Craig about the skill set. I'm, as someone growing up watching Phil Esposito coast for 5 minutes on every shift, and he was great in front of the net. But watching Connor McDavid, watching Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, and Alex Nylander in Toronto, it is such a treat.
William.
Yes, sorry, I said Alex. It's because my son's Alex. But it was it's such a treat watching these skill sets. And I used to, as a fan growing up in Toronto, I used to hate the opposing teams. But now when I watch hockey games, I admire the skill set of all the players in the NHL. And I see moves, passes, shots, the way they think the game. It's just, it boggles the mind.
It's true. It's great. And thank you again for this conversation. Alex, as we wrap it up, I think you've recommended Craig's book as strongly as you possibly could, which is a good thing. But for people who are listening to this conversation who might want to get a hold of you or John to have a conversation to talk about other things, how could they reach out to you and get a hold of you?
They can go to our website, which is medwealth.ca. That is med-wealth.ca. And they can subscribe to The Athletic as well to further help Craig and his cause.
Yeah, please.
As a subscriber to The Athletic, I wholeheartedly endorse that as well, as a matter of fact.
And we are also subscribers, and we really enjoy it.
For those of you who are listening to this podcast for the first time and who are not yet subscribers, I would think the desire to listen to part 1 would be enough. Go ahead, hit the subscribe button, follow the podcast. That way, every time a new episode is dropped, you won't have to remember where did I hear this? How often does it come out? You'll be notified. You won't ever miss another podcast. And you'll remember to go back and listen to part 1 of this conversation. Until next time, I'm Bill Tucker on behalf of John, Alex, and everybody at MedWealth. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen today and to remind you that you can go out today and make today a great day or not. The choice is yours. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.